Hello and welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's summer box set, a one topic a week deep dive into the big issues that are going to be facing the government when it returns, and so do we, from our summer holidays. I'm Anne McElroy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates from Sky News. This week, it's the biggie. It's the economy. And joining us for our deep dive is somebody who goes deeper than anyone else in that area. It's Sky's very own Ed Conway, economics and data editor and host of the new Stuff Matters podcast. Welcome, Ed.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Well, we talk about economics, Ed, but really economics is the underpinning of everything that is going to define this new Andy Burnham era, and particularly what stands and what falls when we get to the budget. Now, we think that's going to be in October. They may give themselves some wriggle room and go towards November. We might well know the date by the time this podcast is out. But what do you think, big picture, is going to be at stake here for the government when it all gets inked in on that day?
Gosh, I mean, I think it is big at the moment because, so there's the kind of ostensible, obvious stuff that we know is on the list. There's the bits and pieces we've heard about over the course of the kind of summer when they came in the first few weeks. There is, I think, towering over everything else, there is this enormous bill from the Defence Investment Plan. So, kind of £4-5 billion, big hole you need to fill. No chancellor or prime minister likes to go into a budget knowing that they're kind of starting with basically a black hole, albeit, maybe is it bigger? Is it smaller than the one Rachel Reeves had to fill when she came in? But, that is an enormous task. And then on top of that, like you say, kind of everything ultimately comes back to economics, or at least so I think as the person who covers economics. And I think, when you think about all of the kind of language we've heard from Andy Burnham so far, he's asking some really interesting questions about the nature of the economy and about both the public sector, but also, where growth is going to come from, the cost of living kind of challenges for the UK. There is a kind of, incoherence is probably going a bit too far, but there are a lot of disparate views, which at the moment we don't have any kind of numbers on how you actually turn that into reality. And so for me, the budget is truly interesting because he has thrown out a lot of fascinating kind of policy ideas and thoughts, but in the end you have to kind of put it down on paper. And this is, I guess, the moment where this reputation that he has in some circles of being somewhat indecisive, well, with a budget you just have to put it down there. It has to go into a scorecard. You have to have numbers, and those numbers, if they're going to affect people's lives, those numbers will end up likely being quite big, and that means then you have questions about how affordable is it, how many compromises do you have to make in the future, what do you do with spending, what do you do with welfare. And so to me, all of the chewy stuff that they probably aren't looking forward to dealing with, that's when that comes hopefully in the budget, unless it's just kind of a ticking over budget, in which case that's an interesting political question about what, are they just paving the way for some sort of a early general election? But you guys know much more about that kind of stuff than I do. So,
I think in the next 10 weeks, in the run up to the budget, whenever it finally comes, they've got to make some pretty hard and fast decisions.
Yeah.
They've got to decide whether or not they're broadly continuing a strategy set by Keir Starmer and delaying big investment decisions, be it on defence, be it on social care, be it on council house building, all of these things that he signalled he wants to do, but will all require massive extra spending. He's got to decide whether to lean into more borrowing. He's got to decide whether or not to increase the amount of tax. So in my book, the next 10 weeks will determine whether or not Andy Burnham's premiership ultimately is a success or not. And I think in that context, it's probably no surprise that around the same time as the budget, we're going to get what Andy Burnham talked about on the steps of Downing Street, which is the 10-year plan for Britain. So his vision of what he wants to do, almost like a kind of manifesto that he didn't have time to write in the run-up to becoming prime minister, because all of that period was quite concertinaed.
By the way, that is the weird thing about the last, kind of the period, after he came into office, is it felt very kind of manifesto-y, didn't it? That, and so you had lots of really kind of quite interesting and actually enlivening conversations about things like social care and about technical education. all of which felt like a kind of an election before we get the manifesto, before we actually get the numbers. And so to me, what's interesting is all that stuff is probably quite expensive. Well, it is expensive, maybe slightly less so technical education, but social care is expensive. And that's before you get to kind of defence.
But the big question that underlines all of it is, can you do some of it or much of it in this parliament before an election?
Yeah.
Because there are two worlds that I can see. And at moment of record, basically Andy Burnham has one of two paths. He could largely do steady as she goes, not try and raise taxes, not try and to put into effect any of those big plans, knowing that he can change the landscape a lot more after an election because he's put it in a manifesto and got the popular vote. Or he could go big now, hope that he's got 2.5 years before he needs to call a general election, and that people will, I suppose in some way, thank him for taking some big decisions pretty quickly, and there'll be some kind of reward. And that's what we find out from this budget. Go big and go long, or go small and wait until an election, which he denies will be any earlier than a full term, but we wait and see.
But I suppose that's the thing. Is like go big in this case. Does go big mean basically throwing out the manifesto pledges on tax? Because he said he's wedded to those, and for me, it's very hard to see how you can afford much of this stuff in a way that's kind of growth positive for the economy without kind of going to some of the big taxes. I suspect one of the things, I think it's the easiest lever to pull. So, that there are never any easy pots of money, but as they go, I would say one of the easier pots of money is to tax banks more, because banks are doing pretty well right now. But you can make the case that actually there's this whole thing that Reform have been banging on about, understandably, because it is kind of actually quite interesting and relevant about the way that the Bank of England is kind of managing the kind of interest rates and the amount of money flowing around the financial system through something called quantitative tightening. Banks have done really well out of this. So banks have benefited from this. The Bank of England's point about this has always been, okay, you could do the kind of reform thing and change the way the Bank of England operates, but just as easy, what that actually is basically a tax on banks. So why don't you cut out the middleman, and if you want to do a tax on banks, then tax banks. So I think of all the taxes opportunities out there, a tax on banks, I would say, is the most likely thing that could happen in a budget. How much can you raise from it? Maybe a few billion, so not trivial amounts, but it's certainly nowhere near enough on its own, I would say, to fill in the whole, for defence, let alone ambitious extra things.
Can I ask you what difference you think it means, Ed, having John Healey, Treasury, as Chancellor instead of Rachel Reeves? But the obvious one is that he resigned from the Keir Starmer government over the Defence Investment Plan and effectively said to the now outgone Chancellor and to the Treasury that they had not behaved satisfactorily given the challenges that we face in defence and the threat level. Now, in a sense, he's got, what's the worst thing that can happen is you get everything you wished for. You end up as the Chancellor. He has to deal with this and the many other pressures, some of which you both cited, like social care reform being one of the major ones. But when you look at John Healey as a character and the mix that he's going to have there to deal with, which way do you think he's going to move?
Part of the, issue that John Healey faces is he has set a lot of store on, I want to spend much more on defence, I want to get up to 3%, maybe 3.5%. To do that involves massive, well, all else equal, massive tax rises, like massive 3.5p on income tax to just to get to 3.5% GDP on defence spending. So he has to confront the fact that the Treasury has for a long time said, okay, if you want to spend more on defence, you have to cut spending on other things, and those trade-offs are kind of easy to dismiss when you're in the MOD and you're kind of thinking, well, it's the safety of this country. But when ultimately you're in the Treasury and someone is saying, well, if we do this, we're not going to be able to build as many hospitals and as many schools and that, so on and so forth, then it becomes more difficult. But I think there's a broader thing as well, which is that we have, and I just kind of personally fixated on this because I think it really matters. We have for decades been kind of running our economies, and this isn't just the UK, it goes across most of Europe and for the US as well. running our economies with an ethos that what the most important thing of all was keeping things as cheap as possible. And if that meant buying stuff from China, then so be it. You want cheap cars, cheap solar panels, cheap batteries, you just buy them from China. Regardless of the question of, okay, well, hang on, we've got some car factories. Do we not need to kind of ensure that they keep on making things? That has been the emphasis of economic policy in this country for decades and decades. John Healey is coming in at least and talking in a very different way. He's just saying, when we're procuring, we want to be buying stuff domestically. We want to be making more things here. Andy Burnham has talked about reindustrializing. These are, I think, very legitimate kind of conversations to have. But the two things are, you can't have that cake and eat it.
We saw that tension when John Healey was Defence Secretary, because John Healey wanted to buy British and to expand the size of the army. I think some of the army chiefs thought you could buy better equipment from overseas and you didn't necessarily have to have the increase in army capability, which may be popular in parts of the country, but not necessarily mission critical for the nation's defences. So we've seen that tension there. There's another lesson from John Healey's time at the Ministry of Defence I'd be interested in your take on, and it's quite potentially quite a critical lesson, Ed. John Healey oversaw a big strategic defence review last summer that suggested that they needed an uplift in the budget of 2.5%. And then John Healey had to go knocking on Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' door because 6 months later he had to claim, partly the world's changed, partly there are just a few more emerging problems. I need another £25 billion. There was a black hole. Now, we know, because of people that have subsequently gone public, that they kind of knew in the Ministry of Defence that there was a black hole. So John Healey either wasn't aware about a black hole in his own departmental finances at the time that he was Defence Secretary, or he had a bit of a sense of it, but decided that it was unwise to run this up a flagpole. Do you think that's a bit of a red flag for a Chancellor?
Well, I think it's hard to get away with that when you're in the Treasury, because ultimately that is where, if you think about the Treasury being at the heart of allotting all of the money, and then every other department kind of goes to it. That's your kind of process of trying to deal with spending. In the end, the Treasury has one job, which is to try to make everything add up and to try to ensure that people keep as much as possible to their spending plans. So if you think about that as your priority, if you're in charge of this department, that is a massively different priority to being, in charge of health or defence, where it's like, I have this functionality that is important for our country, and therefore I need to try to spend efficiently, but basically get as much spending, as much kind of allotment of budget as I can in order to fulfill that function. So I think the question there, and this is the open question, this is the really interesting question, is does he maintain his defence brain, or does he kind of go native at the Treasury? And perhaps the interesting precedent for that is Rachel Reeves, who came in talking a lot about securonomics. We can stop talking about that now, it seems. Although, who knows whether actually in practice, we'll have something slightly more amped up than that under John Healey. But, she talked about securonomics a lot when she came in. Then she's in office. Did we actually see any kind of policy evidence of it? I'm not sure that we necessarily did, at least not enormously. And so she kind of, I think you can make the case that she kind of went native. And most chancellors who end up in the Treasury quite quickly go native, and suddenly they're having to say to people in previous departments where they worked, oh, I'm sorry, actually, it turns out there isn't really enough money to give you everything you want. So I think that's interesting. And I think, again, the budget is where we begin to learn some of that stuff in black and white.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it, watching the interrelation of Andy Burnham and John Healey, which is inevitably going to be different to that between Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, who I thought for a while seemed to be on quite separate tracks, and they did try to sort of move more in lockstep together. But there's one potential flaw, and I wonder what you think about this, Ed. Andy Burnham, if you think about it, has talked in terms of language as if he can control things. Devolution. I got this solution to our economic woes. In part, it is devolution. It's amping up the North. He clearly believes it. It's a gut instinct. It's his experience from his relatively successful time in Manchester. Then he talks about 40 years of neoliberalism. I never really know what that really means, or when it began or ended.
It's a totally meaningless
Or did we
word.
get a note one day to say it's all over? And what was the neo bit anyway?
Yeah.
But these are all, if you like, concepts that imply a lot of control. And then you look to the world that you cover week to week from economics perspective. We cover perhaps a bit more geopolitics, politics, in which the Strait of Hormuz can go up in flames any given day of the week. What do you think that the economic resilience of this shift of Andy Burnham towards that industrialization, et cetera, is it kind of engineered to be able to cope with external shocks?
Well, they do dovetail. I think that's what's interesting about it is why are you more interested in security now than you were kind of 5-10 years ago? It's because we all see what's happening kind of on our doorstep and elsewhere. And the implied lesson from that is, well, we perhaps we can't just think about a completely laissez-faire attitude. We can't just assume that if we order something from China, it's necessarily going to be able to turn up. And we can't just put all of our kind of economic eggs in one basket. And that's basically some of the vibes that we're hearing about from particularly from Healey, but to some extent from Andy Burnham as well. But like I say, that's a really, really hard thing to do. And it involves putting money aside. And like the example I like to give is so if you want to kind of defend yourself, you need to be able to make steel, you need to be able to make weapons grade steel, you need to be able to make tools that are going to make whatever kind of equipment, artillery, whatever it is that you're going to be making. For that, you need steel. We make a bit of steel here. You need tungsten. Tungsten is a metal that we get almost 90%, if not more, of from China. We have a tungsten mine in this country. There is actually the world's second biggest resource of tungsten in Devon. Who knew? But the mine struggles to get up and running because it can't compete with China, because the price of tungsten, that China's selling it at, is below what it costs to get it out of the ground and refine it here. If you want to have domestic tungsten, then you're gonna have to find some way of kind of subsidizing that mine, basically. And that basically means the government, us taxpayers, putting some money in to ensure that we have domestic production of this thing. And if you imagine that just multiplied by thousands, if not hundreds of thousands across the economy, then you have a sense of the reality of what it actually means to reindustrialize. It means actually spending more money. It means people are gonna, if you're thinking about a cost of living crisis, things will be more expensive. And AI and various different productivity enhancing kind of opportunities can get you some of the way, but there is no kind of magic way of achieving this without some difficult decisions.
You mentioned the cost of living and mentioned the Straits of Hormuz. I want to ask a bit more of a traditional economics question, which is just the outlook facing voters, facing the government over the next few months. At the time of pod recording, we seem to be on an on-off ceasefire in vis-a-vis Iran and the Straits of Hormuz, and that's obviously had quite a big impact on prices, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and the oil price has gone up, inflation's gone up, interest rate trajectories have gone up. Does it feel like the next year is going to be one of squeeze on individual households, on people paying mortgages and remortgaging, on the amount of wiggle room that the government has and the costs of government borrowing and the amount of headroom it has? Are things about to get more difficult or probably stay the same?
Well, obviously, it's entirely impossible to answer that question, because it all comes back to, what's Donald Trump going to do in the Straits of Hormuz? What's the Iranian IRGC going to do? More to the point. So with that proviso, if you think back, kind of to just after February, when the Straits were closed and when those attacks happened on Iran, everyone was really quite nervous about the UK economy. It looked like we might be kind of about to face a massive rise in the cost of living. It looked like the Bank of England was going to have to raise interest rates. It looked like maybe there might even be a recession because growth wasn't that strong. At least the official numbers weren't that strong. Since then, inflation has risen, but it hasn't gone up as much as expected, or at least is higher than it looked like it was going to be. But is nowhere near the kind of scary numbers that a lot of people were talking about back then. The Bank of England hasn't had to raise interest rates so far, and it might not have to. And growth, the state of the economy, is kind of, it's not great, but it's okay. And no one's talking about a recession at the moment. So actually put all that together, and in the scheme of things, we're not in a bad place. And an interesting thing, Andy Burnham, so far, what he has said about AI has been much more kind of skeptical than previous kind of leaders and chancellors and so on. He did that famous bit on social media about AI can't build this train. But the reality is, if you look around the world at the countries which are seeing kind of enormous rises in their economic growth and basically just their prosperity, a lot of it at the moment, and who knows, it might be a bubble, but at the moment, a lot of it is coming through AI. And so, if you subscribe to the notion, and I think it's kind of compelling, that we are right now in the midst of a kind of industrial revolution, which is kind of what AI could consist of, rather than talking about the looms that made Manchester in the first place. You're talking about the kind of the codes and the chips that are building the tools enabling us to automate all sorts of kind of services work. If we're in the midst of that, then that is one of the biggest economic moments to live through in generations, if not centuries. And the UK needs to think about what is our strategy and what's our part going to be in that. And it does seem, it's hard to tell, but it feels like he's slightly relegated AI compared with previous leaders.
We have an episode of the box set on this very
is there
topic.
another?
You will be delighted
So does that mean,
to know.
does that mean shut up, stop talking about AI?
No, I think absolutely.
But it's a big
right.
deal.
And
It's a really big deal.
why we decided, of the 4 topics that we chose, to have the economy, but
That
also
was a smart
a deeper dive
very smart
into
move.
AI, precisely for that reason, but also how does Andy Burnham see the kind of pleasures or pitfalls of that when he's decided if it can build a train or not. Opinions differ on this.
Yeah.
On
It could
this
probably help you
matter.
build a train better. But anyway, by the end of this box set, everyone will know.
And by the end of the box set, exactly, we'll leave that cliffhanger there. I had another, perhaps more minor cliffhanger for you, but I've just got myself quite intrigued as to the economic advice that Andy Burnham is seeking, and John Healey will also be putting his team in place to get his own advice on that. I know Sam's very, very plugged into that, into the sort of personnel, but what it means, really. And we had Andy Burnham putting in place as advisors people like Lord O'Neill, Jim O'Neill, who's solid banker, sort of Labour's go-to banker of choice.
Yeah, and the Tories, he advised the Tories for a
he
bit
did,
as well.
he did, but I think he's a more
he's-
comfortable fit for Labour,
Yeah,
if you know
I
what I
think
mean.
that's fair,
I'm not making a big assumption here about, except I am. So can someone like Jim O'Neill, or that kind of advice stream, which says flex a little bit more around what you mean by fiscal rules, when we heard from him on the Sam and Anne podcast, he was a bit, you've tied yourselves in knots here. Is there a way you can stick to those rules because they think that's good for reassurance, flex the borrowing in some clever way that we haven't thought about yet?
I mean, I hate fiscal rules. I think it's just such a kind of dreary topic. And this is not just, I love economics and I love the fiscal conversations. I think that everyone fixates, and no offense to lobby journalists, but there becomes this kind of fixation with headroom, and it's this kind of monolithic thing about how much headroom's left. And actually, it is a much less binary conversation than that. I think, to me, one of the most interesting stories, in the kind of interregnum period, and indeed when Andy Burnham kind of actually came in, was no one's talking about the bond markets. Rachel Reeves was kind of, I think, hoping that the bond market was going to be much more unstable. Not that she would ever actually hope it would be unstable, but she kind of assumed for a while, after what happened last year with tears in the House of Commons and the bond market reacting, I think she assumed that the minute that she left, there might be more instability. What to me is kind of striking is the fact that the bond markets seem to be relatively relaxed about Andy Burnham coming in so far, touch wood, and obviously the proof of the pudding will be when we see the actual budget and the numbers. But so far, a lot of words have been talked, a lot of kind of, grand notions about what we're going to do to the economy have come out. But you don't see much of a kind of, no one's freaking out in financial markets. And so that, to me, I think is the one to watch. Because ultimately, what's the bond market doing? It's giving you a judgment on whether people think they want to put money into the UK. And partly that's what's happening with the public finances. Partly it's a statement on what the Bank of England is doing as well, which is, we shouldn't forget. But ultimately, no one is running away right now. And believe me, if we're thinking about, okay, what are the things that Andy Burnham might want to spend money on, and it's going to be quite expensive and so on, people in the bond market are thinking about that, and they are many chess moves ahead of us, I dare say. And so they are not freaking out right now. And I think that is a non-trivial story, which perhaps hasn't come out as much for the last few weeks.
In part, I suspect, because Andy Burnham's come in, and in those first 2 quite kinetic weeks, talked big but didn't do a huge amount. For better or for worse, the sums being spent were small, and you can quibble about whether they were funded or unfunded. But this takes us back to the starting point, which is I think it's all to play for in the budget. Big, small, taxes, borrowing, spending. We don't know what it's going to look like. And that's why I think we're in for quite an exciting 10 to 12 next week.
Am I allowed to ask a question? Because it's not normally the
I
done
don't know.
thing.
I mean, it wasn't in my
Sam
contract.
So, what do you guys think? What would your money be on between early election or election? Bang on, or indeed at the last possible moment. Go on. Do you have a hunch? Anne, why don't you go first?
My hunch is not early. I think everything, and they may be making a bit of a sort of Burnham thought mistake here. I think they do believe they can control more than they can control. I think it's one thing I think that's just pertains to the soft left.
They think they can do some stuff.
Yeah, they think they can do stuff, and that powers them, and that makes them a fresh alternative to Keir Starmer. It's just sometimes I've riffed on it already when I hear the number of isms that are flying about, which fundamentally a lot of it really is a protectionism. Makes me think that they want to try things and that they think they can change the economy in some ways that people will find more welcome, more germane as a solution to their lives and their problems than things that have been tried before. And that would suggest that they need a bit of time for that to bed in. I don't know whether that means you edge it right towards the last possible date, but there's still quite a lot of road to go. I mean, Keir Starmer, God bless him, but he did end up out of office only 2 years in. So they don't need to choose between going right to the edge. But I think the idea of a snap election, I'm not sure why you would do it until a couple of your ideas have landed. You get through the first big budget bang that Sam is indicating is the moment of truth. Then you want some time to show that you had some success, don't you?
I think that's broadly right. Look, I think Andy Burnham has placed huge store on people taking him at face value, taking him at his word. And he couldn't have been clearer. No early election. He said it again and again. And I think he would be nervous about going back on that. The lesson from the first 2 weeks was talk big, act small. There have been quite a lot of moments in their opening few days where they discuss going bigger and pull back. Maybe that's the pattern that we'll end up seeing in the budget in October, but I don't think there's any desire to do anything precipitous. Andy Burnham, somebody who thinks outside the box, but then his thinking hits Whitehall ways of doing things, the fiscal rules that you hate, the budgetary methods of the Treasury that he has hated forever, but he hasn't pushed his vision through against the opposition of the more traditional ways yet. Whether or not he can do so in just 10 weeks, that feels a bit early to me. So I think he's going to give himself and give all of us a bit of time. Time, obviously, something that we don't have because we have now hit our temporal limit. You probably hate that as well, don't you, Ed?
That was my fault.
We've hit the temporal limit, and
just wanted to subvert the format.
And we don't want to be in breach of our temporal limit because otherwise,
if you can't keep us on time and on budget, and you're the economics guy, then we're really up the creek.
Ed, thank you very much indeed for joining us.